Now, since the season previews are done, I kind of have to hold myself to the standings that I was predicting. So if you noticed in the previews, I was predicting a range. And so I went through and I've tracked that range, and now I'm going to force myself to put teams in a position in the division. And the biggest problem I have when I do this, it happened last year too, you don't predict enough teams that made the playoffs last year are going to miss the playoffs the following season. There will always be teams that miss the playoffs the following season. There will always be teams that disappoint. There will always be teams that are pleasant surprises, like Carolina was, like the Islanders were. And so there's always going to be those biases. That being said, 8th spot in the Pacific, I'm guessing, is going to be LA. Lack of scoring and all of these other problems they had, it's tough to just... It's fixed. So I have LA there, and I think there's more rebuilding to do. Number 7, I have the Oilers. Yeah, I know. Oiler fans don't like it. It just doesn't look like there's been tremendous improvement on the roster over the offseason, and other teams in the division are still, in my eyes, ahead of them, which includes 6th spot, Anaheim, who had the goal-scoring problems this past season. I think they're going to have a better year this year, but I don't think it's going to lead them into the playoffs. And yet, and I've said, and this is likely true, these guys are going to surprise us this coming season. With the goaltending they have with Gibson and Miller, it is absolutely possible these guys slide back into the playoffs. 5th spot, I went with Arizona, who I think are going to be, again, a tough team to play against, very competitive night in and night out. I just don't see them as a playoff team because, again, we end up getting prejudiced by what we saw the season before. 4th spot, I have Vancouver. Is that playoffs? No. That is not playoffs. So, our first playoff line is above Vancouver. As heartbreaking as that is for me, the first playoff line is above Vancouver. Number 3 in the division, I'm going with San Jose. The Sharks, I think, downgraded their attack in the offseason. I'm seeing some posts by Sharks fans who feel that the team's better off having kept Karlsson and got rid of Pavelski. And yet, Pavelski did have 38 goals last year, and that's going to be hard to replace. So we'll see whether or not they're able to replace that. But I do foresee them ending up further down the standings than they were this past season. I still see them in the playoffs, though. Number 2, I have Calgary. The Flames, I think, had a lot of career years sprinkled in there, and everything went their way during the regular season. I think this coming season will be more of a challenge, only because it kind of has to be. Which means that number 1 in the Pacific, I have the Vegas Golden Knights because they're top 6, and as long as their goaltending stays intact, I think they're the best of the Pacific. I do think of the 4 teams that I have in first in their division, they're probably going to be rated lower than the other 3 in terms of points during the regular season. But that's just that whole perception that the Pacific is weaker than the other divisions. We'll see whether or not that's true, but that's how I see it. And I know there's people who think Vegas is going to miss the playoffs, Calgary is going to miss the playoffs, and there's certainly people who think San Jose is going to miss the playoffs because of the losses they've suffered. Moving on to the Central Division, and number 7, I have Minnesota. And I didn't really have to think about it very hard because Minnesota, again, it looks like they're older and there's all this dysfunction. Paul Fenton's out now. There's too much dysfunction in my eyes in Minnesota for the team to turn around this year. It's likely, I think, going to be next year. Number 6, I had a tough time with this. Chicago likely finishes higher than 6th, but again, the prejudice in favor of teams that made the playoffs last year is real. It's there, and it's there for a reason. So Chicago likely is going to be better. I have them as the number 9 team in the West as the last team to miss the playoffs, and the playoff line is right above them in the Central. So 3 teams in the Pacific, 5 teams in the Central is my prediction, and I have Winnipeg in 5th spot. Winnipeg is, to me anyways, weaker right now than they were 12 months ago. And they ended up having a 99-point season. This year I figure they fall back to probably 92 or 93, maybe as low as 90, but if they fall below 90, odds are they miss the playoffs and Chicago gets in. They're right on that line, and again, I'm half tempted to pull them out of the playoffs based on how their off season's gone, but I didn't go that far. 4th in the division, I went with St. Louis. I think winning a Stanley Cup could lead to a slow start for them, maybe a slow first quarter of the season, and they pick it up later on. They were 3rd in the division last season. I think 4th in the division, quite possible for them, and it may even involve the same number of points. I think there's other teams that may have just improved. Number 3, I went with Dallas. There are people picking them to be Stanley Cup favorites in some situations. I haven't heard that as much the last few weeks as I did after they got Pavelski and Perry, and this fixes everything. I don't think it fixes everything, but I still think they're going to be pretty darn good. So above them in 2nd position, I have the Colorado Avalanche. This, of course, is contingent on Grubauer being able to play as a starter for the full season and Francouz being ready to step in as the backup. So this is a perilous prediction, and we'll get into the ones that I think are more perilous than others. But yeah, this one I have some concerns about. And number 1, of course, for people who are well aware of who's in this division, I have the Nashville Predators. So to me, the Nashville Predators still win the Central. I think adding Duchesne has helped them tremendously. Theirs is dependent on Pekka Rinne, much like, and Bishop, right, in Dallas, Binnington in St. Louis. The top 4 positions here, if these 4 teams, any of them have problems with their goaltending, they could fall and prove me completely wrong, and potentially prove me completely wrong by end of November. Because remember, when the early stats are being tabulated in around end of October, can't really come into this video and go, "Ha, look, you were wrong," because very often the end of October doesn't tell us a whole lot. End of November tells us a little bit more. All right, moving to the East. So there you go. There's your top 5 teams in the West, which would mean Calgary and San Jose in the first round in the West, and Colorado and Dallas as well. And then St. Louis and Winnipeg. Winnipeg would likely play Vegas. St. Louis would play Nashville. Could be some fun playoffs right there. All right. Number 8 in the Metro, I have Columbus. And again, there may be a prejudice because we saw teams exit that team the way they did. Nick Foligno was talking today about how he feels they still have a good team and people aren't buying into it. But the guys who've left and didn't buy into it, may very well regret it later. He understands leaving for more money, but he feels they were building something in Columbus. And so to him, they're still a playoff team. Number 7, I had to go with the Rangers. Again, the Rangers made some improvements in the offseason, and then they had to shed some depth for those improvements. And there could still be more shedding of depth for those improvements. And that to me is it's kind of hard to sell them then as being a better team when that happens. Number 6, I have the New Jersey Devils, who I think will be better. I think they'll be right in the running right up till the end of the season. I think the East is going to be very highly contentious this year. I know, that's a surprise, right? So I have them in 6th, and then in 5th, and I had to really think about it, I have Carolina. You'll notice I haven't drawn a line because I think there's going to be 4 teams in the Atlantic and 4 teams in the Metro. And I think that playoff line is going to be right above the Carolina Hurricanes. I'm going to make sure it's all the same color. So for me, the playoff line is right above Carolina. And yeah, so that's the Eastern team that I'm thinking probably misses that made it last year. It's only the one. And the one Eastern team getting in that I think, that made it last year, I'm going with Philly. You got Carter Hart and Philly, and you've just got this really solid looking roster overall. Yes, Kevin Hayes is overpaid, but they've got a very good deep forward group, and I think their blue line has been improved in the offseason. That and the fact that the Philadelphia Flyers traditionally have a year out and a year in, and a year out and a year in. So I went, all right, I'll put Philly in the playoffs. Number 3, I went with the Islanders for Barry Trotz's reasons. Barry Trotz, the best coach in the NHL. I think somehow he gets the New York Islanders into the playoffs again. Whether or not they win anything in the playoffs, that's a whole other discussion. But yes, while they're going to miss Robin Lehner, going into last year, we said Lehner and Greiss was one of the weakest tandems in the National Hockey League. So they very well may work some magic with Varlamov as well. And that may work out very well for them. Number 2, Pittsburgh. The Penguins, have they been weakened in the offseason? You could argue that they have. You could also argue that without Kessel, if that's going to help the locker room, if that's going to help Mike Sullivan coach the team, they could be just as good, if not better. Which means that number 1, I'm predicting the Capitals. And again, I'm not taking away from what I said about them in the preview, that they have some weaknesses. Their blue line makes me very nervous. And yet they have the forward depth, and Braden Holtby should be able to bounce back from last season. He is one of the better goaltenders in the National Hockey League, did not have one of his best seasons last year. I'm expecting a bounce back, and without the Stanley Cup hangover, that drive to succeed should be back again for them. So I have the Caps first in that division. And last but not least, the Atlantic, which has Ottawa, in my opinion, in the last position. The Senators, what is there to say other than the plucky Senators, who have an owner that most Ottawa fans aren't happy with? I see them in last place, 7th. I see the guys that I'm wearing the jersey of right now, Detroit, ending up 7th. Again, the future's bright for probably both of these teams. I know it's bright for Detroit. For Ottawa, probably. They're going to have to, at some point, spend money to bring guys in, and that might be where the owner steps in and goes, wait, spend money. I used to do that. I don't do that anymore. Number 6, and this was tough because I think Buffalo's got better. I think Buffalo's going to be better. I think it'll be incremental improvement. This is one of those ones that could really surprise us and end up being much, much better than most are picking them. And again, there's Buffalo fans who say we're going to be back in the playoffs, but I've seen a lot of people saying they'll be better but not quite playoff ready yet. Number 5, just below the playoff line, I have Montreal, who I think are going to be right in line with where they were last year. Which again, if you're a Montreal fan, you're like, oh, please don't let us miss the playoffs again and end up with a point total that would get us in the playoffs in the West. It could happen. 4th, I went with Boston. I went with Boston in 4th last year too, remember? I said Boston was going to be 4th in the division, and I had many of the same reasons that I have them in 4th this coming season. See how that turns out. 3rd spot, Florida. Florida's going to be better with Bobrovsky. Florida's biggest issue last year was goaltending. So I have Florida in the playoffs. I have Philly in the playoffs. I have, and then the West is all the exact same 8 teams. So that's when I'm probably being too conservative. Number 2, I went with Toronto. I know that there are people who think, Toronto's going to crash out. Adding Tyson Barrie is huge. Yes, they lose out some grit with losing Nazem Kadri, but adding Tyson Barrie is, I think, huge for their special teams. Their lack of a power play towards the end of the season and their special teams issues they had at times this past season was a big part of the reason why they ended up falling in round 1, 2, I think. And so adding to that will help. 5-on-5 play, they've got guys who can go 5-on-5. It's that power play they wanted to fix. which means number one in the Atlantic, I have the Tampa Bay Lightning. No, they won't get 63 wins. No, they won't end up with 128 points. But while they may not set a record in wins, 63 would be a new record, and while they may not equal last year's total in points, which was 128, I do think this team's going to be pretty darn good, and I still think if we're looking for a team that can win the President's Trophy, I wouldn't actually be surprised if it was the Capitals, because they seem to like winning President's Trophies. The problem is I'm picking the Capitals to win the Stanley Cup, so if they win the President's Trophy, that goes right out the window, as tradition would tell you, right? I don't believe in curses, but yeah, I'll go ahead and agree and jump on that bandwagon too. Odds are this is probably too conservative. Odds are some teams below the playoff line could surprise us. I think of Anaheim, I think of Chicago, New Jersey, Rangers, Buffalo, and Montreal as just examples off the top of my head. But if I bumped Buffalo and Montreal into the playoffs and took Boston and Florida out, that doesn't work for me. But again, we'll see how much this is prejudiced by last year's standings when we look back at the end of this coming season. So let me know what you guys think in the comment section below, as I know everybody will. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through, just tapping upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon.